City Hall and want to welcome you. It's a pleasure to have you here this afternoon. There are a few people I think that could be joining us, and as in church, they're going to get to come to the front of the line because they didn't get here in time to get a seat in the back, but that'll be the case. We'll try not to make too much fun of them. Just a few housekeeping things. There's a restroom up here behind Joe, and as I told the group yesterday, you're welcome to use that, but I would be quiet because everybody in here can hear anything that you do. And if you have any kind of thing going on, everybody's going to know about it. So be careful. If you want to be a bit more discreet, there's a restroom for the men and the women down the hall. There's a fillies and a colts, and I'm not going to tell you all how you should sexually identify today, but pick the one that suits you the best and use that. It's down the hall on the left. Before we get started today, I want to introduce some of our team that's here. Y'all come on in. Sit wherever you'd like. I want to introduce a few of our team that are here. So I've got some. Megan, could you ask everybody to come back here a minute? First, I want to start off with the main man, Mr. Robert Hall, our president, is here. I want to brag on Mr. Bob. Many of you all may have seen in the popular press or on the inside of most bathrooms that you frequent that in November he was inducted into the Saddle and Sirloin Club, which is a very prestigious group of people who basically make up the Hall of Fame of the livestock industry in the United States. So we're really proud of him. One person a year is inducted. He has a portrait now hanging in Louisville in the Kentucky Fair and Exposition Center. Goes back, I think there's about 150 plus or minus people in that are quite famous people. So we're very proud of him for being inducted into that recently. The main person in command here is the general. That's Julia Hall. She's the general with quotes around it, but at the end of the day, we call her our vice president, first impressions. So all the touch points here. And I would highly encourage y'all to eat. So this stuff here is bacon, bourbon, Chex Mix, and Tom Hinkle will agree it's like crack, isn't it, Tom? Tom and I have already decided we're going to go into the conference room. I think I got a bottle or two of bourbon in there, lock the door, and sit and drink bourbon and eat this stuff. And maybe pipe this in, but it's really good. So I would encourage you to do that. Pimento cheese and ham biscuits, and there's drinks in the back, so please make yourself at home and eat the stuff, because if you don't, some of the rest of us will be left with it. Morgan McQuarrie drives our sales on, for lack of a better description, I would call it emerging markets. So anything that's new, sport horse, Western disciplines, all that sort of thing, which is a growing portion of our business. Morgan drives that and also does work with some of our thoroughbred accounts from time to time. Steve Cadell on the technical service and technical assistance side of the business has been with us. I don't think we could calculate exactly how many years yesterday. We were trying.
April 1991, I looked last night. Okay, so you know when you started working.
28.
Well, I knew it was April 15th.
So what is that? 91, 28 years ago, something like that. Steve, as Joe will tell you in a few minutes, has kind of led this whole effort around weighing and collecting this growth information for all those years. And I don't know, we didn't really talk about it yesterday, but there have to be tens of thousands of horses into this at this stage of the game. So Steve's been involved with collecting that. Kara Knockelman, don't worry about the second part, right? Kara is one of our voices of customer service here. I'm sure many of y'all have a chance to talk to Kara weekly or bi-weekly to try to get your orders sorted out, and she would tell you she's the one that's there to straighten it out when somebody else messes it up. So please make a point to meet Kara, and I'll start to say meet Carly, and we'll try to do that in a minute. Maybe she'll get back here. Megan Garzillo is now on the team, and we brought her on strictly to keep Steve Cadell in line. We were finding that Steve couldn't get any work done during the course of the day for getting to the first stop and wanting to spend all day talking. So we had to get somebody to move him along a little quicker, and that's Megan now. So now they're able to get a little bit more work done, to the point that they need more to do now because I see them too early in the day. So obviously they're not they're moving too quickly. But Megan is very capable in our technical services side of our business. Does a lot of work with ration balancing, with our weights and growth information and things of that sort. Perfect timing. Carly Gwynn is kind of all things. Yeah, Carly's all things customer care. So if you've got a problem that KER has made, which I'd say I just now throw her under the boot, but one or the other will have to straighten out the other one's problems. So we're pleased to have them here as well. And finally, I think the only person I haven't introduced in the group is Jeff. Oh, Anthony. Yeah. Anthony is our cameraman today. Anthony Cook. We had 20% of the Cook family here yesterday. We had Gus here as well. Room was full. And so glad to have Anthony here. Anthony's our Director of Sales and Marketing and has kind of been responsible for putting this all together and getting many of you all here today. So we're glad to have him as well. Finally, Jeff Pendleton, General Manager. Been with us for a long, long time, kind of keeping everything in line and running the administrative portion of the business and the business part of the business and the manufacturing part of the business and everything it takes to make us go. So I think I've got everybody now. Did I miss anyone? Again, we're pleased to have you all here. When we're finished, we'll have a little time for question and answers. Any of you all that have never had an opportunity to take a quick walk through the plant, I would encourage you to stick around. I think Jeff's going to do that when the session's over. It's a pretty cool facility, lots of equipment and robotics and toys and things like that you wouldn't normally think you'd see in a feed manufacturing plant. So I think you would enjoy that if you had time to look around. And with that, I want to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Joe Pagan is the founder of Kentucky Equine Research, and because he's the founder, he's the president, so it kind of works interestingly. You make a job and then you fill the job. But Joe has grown his business since the mid-'80s into kind of a one-man consulting, product development company to now a multi-country with operations throughout the world, that are consulting to horsemen, feed manufacturers, product development, has really taken his business and grown it to new heights and new levels, along with the help of his general manager and CEO, and I don't know what all, CFO and managing director, Eileen Fathian, who's here. We're glad to have her again for the second day. Joe's a native of Arkansas, got his degree initially at the University of Arkansas, then matriculated to Cornell, where he got his graduate degree, did some graduate studies over in Scandinavia, and then made it back to the United States to work in the commercial feed industry, and then subsequently found KER. So Joe, with that, it's all yours, sir.
Thank you, sir.
You bet.
It's great to see so many familiar faces and talk about the good old days with some of them. It's a pleasure to be here with you to talk about thoroughbred growth, and it's something kind of near and dear to my heart that we've been studying for a long time. Before I start, though, I want to once again acknowledge my co-presenters, really, and that's Steve Cadell and Megan from Hallway, who really are responsible for collecting, Steve particularly through the years, collecting all of these data that for the most part I'm going to be talking about, and Eileen Fathian from KER, who's been very instrumental in developing the software that we use and also in gathering up the information that I'm going to tell you about today's study. Lee told you a little bit of my background. I actually started working in the Central Kentucky thoroughbred industry in the mid-1980s. So I've been around here for a while, and ever since I've been here, we've been worried about growth and we've been worried about skeletal problems. And looking back, sort of the journey, I'd like to kind of relive that a little bit before we look at some new information which we have just developed, which I think is making it a little more clear. To kind of show you how long we've been doing this, I found this magazine cover. This is from 1994. It was Modern Horse Breeding, and that was the precursor of the Horse magazine. And you may recognize the young fellas standing there. That's Wayne McElraith on the left, Larry Bramblage in the middle, and then that young dark-haired guy who's considerably more thin than now was me. And the cover headline was Beating DOD, Developmental Orthopedic Disease, News from the Front. So this actually was a roundtable that happened right after the Kentucky Derby. And in that, the author had us sit around and talk about what do we know about this, how are we beating this. What's interesting about this to this day is that Wayne and Larry don't look like they've aged a bit. And all of us still have the same hairstyles we had from 25 years ago. Mine's considerably less dark than it was then. I was advocating even at this point that growth was important in this. If you remember about this time, this was in the aftermath of this big study that had come out from Ohio State in 1985. And this was the first time that there was really an indication that trace minerals were important for growth. And that's what everybody was focusing on. It was trace minerals, copper, zinc, copper, zinc. This was the magic bullet. This is going to solve everything. And it didn't solve everything. It helped. It helped in a lot of situations, and we still think it's really important to this day, but it wasn't everything. And again, I was interested in what else besides copper and zinc would make a difference. So I wanted to look at growth. So we started measuring horses, and we started measuring how horses grow. This is not a yearling standing on the scale. Some of you may recognize this as Three Chimneys, and again, the same black-headed, skinny person back there is me, and that's Seattle Slew actually standing on the scale from 1987. So I'm showing my age completely there. But besides weighing stallions, and I think he weighed about 1450 if I recall from 32 years ago, we wanted to also weigh young growing horses. And we had the opportunity to do that with a farm that we were working with at the time who was already weighing its horses regularly. And we were able, in collaboration with the farm's veterinarian, to collect these weigh data and see if there was any relationship to developmental orthopedic disease. There were 271 foals in this 4-year period, so it was a fairly good sized study. And we were using OCD, the measure of that is surgical OCD. And it's important that you define what you're actually talking about. This was ones that probably had visited Dr. Bramblage, most likely, to have surgery. And we had a 10% incidence of surgical OCD. We noticed in this initial study that heavier foals seemed to have more hock OCD and more stifle OCD. So this validated to a certain degree what we were already talking about in terms of there being a relationship between these. We've now established with clarity that in April of 1991, Steve Cadell joined Farmers Feed Mill. And they did something really interesting then. I'd already been working with Steve when he was working for a farm here, Slewness actually, weighing and measuring horses. But when Steve came to Hallway, he was very interested in weighing horses, and they started a weighing program. And it's the one that you guys are all participating in really to this day, where Steve, and now with Megan's help, go around and on a monthly basis they weigh and measure foals. This has been a real treasure trove of information for us, and one of the reasons is it's so complete and it's so uniform because Steve has been going month in and month out gathering these data. Every single condition score that we have, Steve has taken since 1991, so we've got some real good uniformity here, and it's made a big difference in how we understand growth. Because at this point in time, we were using as our growth curve for thoroughbreds data that had been collected at Winfield's farms in Ontario. They had been weighing horses forever through the 70s. Actually, my major professor at Cornell gathered up all the data and created this growth curve. And we adapted it, that this is how thoroughbreds grow. And I think it had Northern Dancer actually was in the growth curve. So it was a huge, nice deal, but it wasn't Kentucky. So in the first few years that Steve was here doing this, we gathered up data and we published this paper of a summary of growth rates in thoroughbreds in Kentucky. And Steve Jackson was also a co-author on this. We were working together at the time. In this paper, we had measured 3 crops of foals, and we took 350 colts and 350 fillies. And we looked at their monthly body weight, height, and condition score. And what we found was really interesting. This is from that paper, so I'm in metric, so basically double that number to get pounds per day. But this is the growth rates of these different foals based on month of birth. And what you see is early on it doesn't seem like it makes a hell of a lot of difference, but when you get out here after 10 months, you see that it starts to go crazy, but it goes crazy kind of rhythmically. And this was very interesting to us, and we now know that the reason for that is if you plot that by the season, you see it's 100% seasonal. If you put it instead of months of age down here, you put the season of the year, all of that goes together, and it's the month of April is when it happens. So this shows just how important the seasonal differences in growth are in central Kentucky. So the other thing we found is horses do not grow the same here as they do in Canada. There's quite a big difference. It's kind of hard to see, but on this graph, the A's are Kentucky, B's are Canada, and you see there's this blip. They kind of join back together later on, but you can see that both in body weight and height, there is a difference in growth. So we adopted this as a new reference curve for us here in Kentucky. Through the years, we've also found that gender makes a big difference. And this is some data showing during the yearling season that colts and fillies grow differently, both in average daily gain and how much condition score they actually put on. You can see that fillies get fatter and have higher condition later in the year. And I think that's probably something that you would go, yeah, we kind of know that happens. We since have adopted this program and done it in different parts of the world as well. Lee introduced that we work around the world. We work with companies that work with breeders in Australia, England, India even, New Zealand, and we've established growth curves for different parts of the world. These are all thoroughbreds, but they all grow very differently. And they grow differently because of the environment they're in. And we've found that probably the hardest place to grow a horse is India. It's hard. They have monsoons in the summer. The grass isn't very good. They don't grow very well. Australia has a different growth curve than here. So we're interested in seeing how the environment and the locale actually affects this. To help us do that, and partially because of Steve working us so hard trying to analyze all these data, we got with a programmer and we produced this program, GrowTrack. So this is a software program that we produced, geez, Steve, I don't even remember when, in the early 2000s. And we used it, we wanted to develop so we could quickly enter these data and we could also represent them graphically. So you know how it works. You enter a foal crop, individual animals, and then when you weigh it, it will produce graphs of height and body weight. This is the body weight graph here. We have the month that the foal was in down here. We have its body weight. The green curve, this is an actual foal here. I just screen captured a kind of a representative foal. This is actually a huge foal, by the way. That's the green. The orange is the reference curve we use. This is a new reference curve, and I'll explain where we got this one. And this is a reference curve we continue to update based on new data. But this is body weight. This is withers height. And then you have a table of all this information. So you've got the date that the foal was weighed. Since we have its birth date, it calculates how old it is. And we also have the foal's weight versus the reference body weight out of that curve. So it calculates the same thing. And you see the percent of reference there. We have that for body weight, and we also have that for height. But there's another number up here that I think a lot of you don't use very much, and that's percentile. We also represent weight and height as a percentile of the population. And this is actually a much more interesting number than the percent of reference. And it's the data that I'm going to show you today is all about percentiles. So why are percentiles important? This is a graph out of GrowTrack that will calculate the percentile and the quartile for an individual horse. Percentiles are good because it allows us to do apples to apples comparisons. We can compare the same day of age and the same gender. So we actually have different reference curves, whether it's a colt or a filly. I already told you they grow differently. And this lets us rank an individual relative to where it is in the population. And so that's the nice thing about percentiles. And this is not new technology. This is for children. If you take your child to a pediatrician, they're going to use a chart like this. And this is a percentile chart. Down here, this happens to be for boys. This is age in years, in this case, for a boy. We've got two curves here. We've got weight and we've got height. We have the median, which is the 50th percentile, and then we've got this spread. And that shows where they are as a percentile of the population. So this chart was from the good old days where you would take a pencil and you would actually put where they are, and you could manually calculate what is the percentile for height and weight. But then you can talk about, oh, well, my boy's big. Well, how big is he? He's in the 75th percentile. Instead of, he weighs 150 pounds. Well, how old is he? And so that we can figure it out. So percentiles makes a lot of sense. The reference curve that I'm going to talk about today that we're still using with GrowTrack is a reference curve from 2013, 14, and 15 foal crops, representing about 3,500 total foals, half of them fillies and half of them colts. So they're two different reference curves. I told you we're updating this now to a 2019 reference curve with even more data. But what you see here is the foal is developed, this graph is divided into different age ranges. So we have age ranges on the bottom. The green is weight, the orange is height. If you look at these for adult people, you see that the percentile curves for women and men are different. This is a height curve here. This is the frequency of the population. So what you see is that the top of that growth curve, or that height curve there, is where most of the people are. And then there's some that are smaller and there's some that are taller. And it goes away from that, and there's some where men and women cross actually at the same height, but then there's some extremes where they don't cross at all. Same thing happens with fillies and colts. You have two different growth curves or normal distributions depending on gender. The other thing that's interesting about this is the distribution curve for weight and for height is very, very different. If you look at weight, the way that you read this curve is you've got the total curve, the middle of it is the median. So 50% are bigger, 50% are smaller. We divide it also into quartiles. So we have the bottom 25%, the next, the next, the next. What you see though is that the second and third quartile is where most of the foals are. The frequency is highest, but there's 25 here, 25 here, 25 here, 25 here. So the width of these are more narrow than when you get out on the tails. Basically, so this is weight, and to go from median to the 75th percentile for weight, I happen to pick a 200-day-old filly. This changes based on day of age and gender. So you can't use one to represent all of them. It's from the entire population. This is weight. For weight for a 200-day-old filly, the 75th percentile is 6% heavier than the reference curve. So it's +6. 25th percentile below is -6. If you look at height, it's a much narrower curve, so that those 25th and 75th are -2% of the reference curve and +2. So we're going 6 here and 2 there in terms of those differences. What does that mean in real numbers? Again, this is a 200-day-old filly, and the median weight is 584 pounds for that filly. That means that that's half the population for 200 days for a filly. That's right in the middle. The 75th percentile is 6% higher than that. That's 617. The 25th percentile is 6% below. That's 551. There's a 66-pound difference for a 200-day-old filly between the 25th and the 75th percentile. When you get out on the wings, though, you look for really big ones or really small ones. The 99.9 is 740, and 0.1 clear at the other end is 430. So there's a 310-pound range between the very biggest and the very smallest in these different wings. That's body weight. This is height. And this is really interesting because the range in height is not very great. If you look, again, a 200-day-old filly, the average is 54 inches tall. If you look at the 75th percentile, it's plus 2% of that, it's 55, and that's 1 inch taller than the median. The minus 2 is 1 inch lower. So there's only a 2-inch difference between the 25th to the 75th percentile, which is pretty amazing. And what's more amazing is I'm going to show you some data where that actually makes a big difference. So that is very important. So we have these percentiles over here, and we've grouped them into age ranges. So the first one we have is, we call it foal, but it's really the first month of age. It's from 1 to 31 days. Now the reason for that is that Steve, he probably should, but he doesn't come when you have a foal every night and weigh your foal. He comes once a month, and so it may be 2 days old, it may be 28 days old, depending on when he gets there. So the first weight really that Steve takes is in that foal category. This is not really a birth weight. I put birth in parentheses here, and I use it in some of these graphs, but I mean the first month. Then we call it suckling. That's from 1 month to 6 months old. It's when they're probably still on the mare. Then we have weanling, which is from 6 to 12 months. Now, granted, you wean at different times, but that's the time category. And then we call over 12 yearlings. So again, if you look at this weight graph, the first graph is that first month of age. The green is weight, the orange is height. The second one, if he's coming every time and you're weighing it every single time, that's the average of 5 different measurements, because he may have weighed that foal 5 times during that time. Or if you've got your own scales, you may have weighed it every day during that time. Our software, you can only weigh the horse once a day, by the way. You can't put multiple weights on the same day into the software. But this is a way that you can get a nice snapshot of how big the foal is. So we've got here, this is percentile up the side, 50, 25, 75 here. And then you can see quartiles. So we've got the lowest 25, the next, the next, the next. I'm going to present the data today in a couple of different formats, actually a few different formats, and one of them is this graph here. So I want to orient you what we're trying to talk about here. If you have a perfect normal distribution and you've got those quartiles set up, you have 25% in each one. The weight range within one may be wide or narrow, but you've got 25. So I've put quartiles down here. This is the percent frequency, so all of them the same color. So we've got 25, 25, 25, 25. And then this is the age range. So we've got it for month 1, weanlings, or sucklings, weanlings, yearlings. That never really happens. That would be a perfect distribution. What I'm going to show you is how we deviate from that with different populations. So we're trying to look at subpopulations either of how good they are or how bad they are, and see if it deviates from that perfect 25. To give you an example of how that deviation can occur, I took from the data that we've been given from the farms we're working with, we look for foals that in their spring survey and their sale radiographs, every single joint was NSA. There was no problems. It was very clean. That's actually a pretty rare thing to find. But I went through and I found a population that did that. There were 52 yearlings in it in this particular group. And this is what real data looks like. So you can see here for the first month of age, these are for the foals that didn't have any problems at all. When they were a month old, 27% of them were in that first quartile. 29 were in the 25 were in the second, 29 third, 19 in the top quartile. And you see it kind of changed a little bit over time. And in fact, when they were yearlings, only 19% of them were in that bottom quartile. So it actually had changed with time. So that's one way that we can present the data. Another simpler way to present it is just, are they bigger or smaller than the median? So we take all of the ones, forget quartiles, and we see, are they below or above? In a perfect world, again, that would be 50-50. In that group of perfect foals in terms of skeletal disease, you can see as the first month it was 52-48, 48-52, but they actually drifted up, so as yearlings, 58% of them were greater than the 50th percentile. We're on the top side of that. Then we can just take within an age group and say, okay, we want the average percentile. So we'll take every foal in that group and we'll just calculate an average. And you do a variation, this is a standard error. This is a good way to look at it because then we can see, is birth different than suckling? Is it different from weanling? Is it different from yearling? If you're comparing the same horse the entire time. If you're putting them all in, you can do a statistical analysis to see that. And then finally, you can just look at the median. And again, here's our all NSA horses. You can see when they were yearlings, they were 48, and that creeped up a little bit. So we've used this percentile measure to look at some performance parameters before. This was an article that I wrote in 2009 that was in the now defunct Thoroughbred Times, where we ask, does size matter? Does it matter for how much you get at sale? Does it matter for how good a racehorse it is? So for the sale data, we looked at 1,000 yearlings that were sold at Keeneland. We weighed and measured their height as yearlings, and then we saw how well they sold. And this is what we found. When we divided them, this is median price and the quartile weight that they were when they were yearlings. You can see the stair step up. About 25,000, 30,000, 40,000, 45,000. So there was a difference in mean weight. And you can go, well, that may just be because of the session they got sold in. But what was really interesting is we looked at the sessions that they were sold in. And this was really pretty amazing. The Book 1 horses yearlings are heavier and they're taller. And it stair steps down as you go through different sessions. And when you get out here in the ones I can afford, they're all below 50% in terms of height and weight. And we've subsequently shown that horses that have high sire indexes also have big foals. So, I mean, it actually goes kind of hand in hand. We then did a big retrospective study looking at 3,700 of the horses that Steve had weighed between 1996 and 2002. And we went back and tried to compare their weights when they were being raised to the racing performance. It's a really interesting paper. One of the things here that I wanted to point out said yearlings in the first weight quartile, that bottom 25%, so they weighed less than 75% of the population, had lower earnings, fewer stakes winners, and a lower sire index than the rest of the population. So those little guys were not as good a racehorses. So that background leads us to the study we want to talk about today. And these data were really interesting because we were looking at publicly available records like sales price and race records, but we also wanted to dig deeper into what about some of the problems that we have with the foals in different types of skeletal issues. How do those relate? So Steve and Megan again went out, gathered this information with the help of you guys to put some of these records together. 6 of the farms that Hallway works with participated in this program, and it was between 2013 and 2017. We actually had 12 individual foal crops representing 318 foals. For a variety of reasons, as that all of you know, you don't weigh necessarily your foal every single time. It might be sick, it might, for some reason, you don't get it. And the one that we had the least amount of data on was actually that first month. We had 248 of the foals that we had that he had weighed as first month sucklings, weanlings, and yearlings. These are the ones that we left in the complete analysis so we could compare how they were changing over time. This is the month of birth for these different foals. The orange that I'm showing here is this study with 300 foals. I'll talk about another study we did earlier with 3,900 foals, looking at the influence of the broodmare as well. And you can see that the distributions are pretty similar. And that is that you have the most foals in March, you have a few less in February and April, you have a lot less in January, and you have less in May. So I don't know how that compares to the national average, but our 2 studies, they were pretty similar. Again, Steve and Megan come out, they weigh and they measure wither height. Those data get taken into the software, and we calculate percentiles. The comparison that we did that was different this time is we also collected the spring survey information on these data. So we asked the farms participating to give us their spring survey information so we could look at the incidence of problems and some of these weight parameters that we were doing. First interesting finding I thought was interesting is 93% of the survey radiographs were taken in February and March. So it's a pretty narrow window. They were read by a total of 6 different veterinarians from the 2 big Rood & Riddle and Haggard's clinics, as well as in collaboration, a few of these farms had their own farm vets. The other thing that was interesting to me is we calculated how old the foals were when the spring surveys were taken. And this is potentially relevant in how we actually interpret it, because they're not at a year of age. They're at a year of age for between March and February. But January foals, the average was 400 days. In May foals, the average was 300 days. So there's 100 days of difference in age of these foals in all of these survey radiographs. And I know that there's some kind of practical considerations of when you can do it, but I just wanted to say this may influence some of the findings that we have. When we got these surveys, they had all sorts of stuff in the surveys. We tried to hone it down as much as we could, and I wanted to concentrate on just 2 different problems for this talk. That's OCD and sesamoiditis. And for OCD, we looked at the joint that the OCD occurred, hock, stifle, and fetlock. And this just lists all of the different ways that these problems were described in these surveys. And this is something that we're trying to improve on to make it where there's some more uniformity in actually how we describe the different problems. You can see for hock OCDs, we had large, mild, small, some described where they were, but there wasn't a lot of uniformity. So what we've done for this study is if it said hock OCD in the hock, it got thrown into this population. We didn't differentiate on severity, on location, and we know that for stifles, that's an important consideration. Where the lesion is for stifles, we accept that that's one of the weaknesses of the way we've analyzed it so far, is that we've just got these 3 big buckets. So how much OCD did we find? We found that this is the incidence of OCD in the spring survey was a 16% incidence. And of that, 25% was in the hocks, fetlocks, 43% in the hock, 32% in the stifle. If you look at the percentage of the total population, that was 4% of these foals had fetlock OCDs in their spring survey, 7 hock, 5 stifle. These are those growth frequencies again. So we start to deviate significantly from that 25, 25, 25, 25. This is for spring OCD for weight. Look at the first quartile for the first 30 days. Only 7% of the foals that had OCD in their spring radiograph were in that bottom quartile. And that persisted when they were on the mare. When they were weaned, it was 10, and still even as yearlings, it was only 12%. So the foals in the first quartile had less spring OCD. That was something that was pretty clear from this. If you look at height, it was even bigger. If you look at the first month, only 5% of the foals that had OCD in their spring radiograph was in the lower 25th. So if you don't want to have spring OCD, have a short, light foal is kind of the take home from this. It persisted through the entire time. So few foals, if they are short and light, the chances of having an OCD in the spring radiograph is lower in this group of horses. Now this is 41 horses, so it's not a huge number, but it's still pretty substantial. If we look at the as just is it above or below the 50th percentile, what you see here is when the foal is on the mare, the first month and up to the first 6 months, you see it's very heavily skewed above the 50th percentile. 76% of the foals that developed OCD were bigger than the 50th percentile. And that persisted into sucklings. Look at weanlings though, the difference went away, and I'll explain a bit of why that happened later. If you look at height though, so heavier nursing foals had a higher incidence in these radiographs. If you look at height, that persisted the entire time. Taller foals that were greater than the 50th percentile, 71% in the first month, but that persisted clear through to when they were yearlings. So in that instance, taller foals, weanlings, and yearlings had a higher incidence of spring OCD. What does this translate into surgical OCD? So I said 16% of them had OCD identified in a spring survey. Based on the severity of the OCD, a decision was made whether to operate them or not. In a lot of them, it was they'll get better or else they're not worth operating, one of the two. But a decision was made so that 9.3% ended up of the population had surgical OCD. So down from 16 to 9.3. Distribution 17% in the fetlock, 56% in the hock, 26% in the stifle. Remember that study I talked about that we did in 1991 through 94? We had a 10% incidence of surgical OCD. So 9.3 to 10, that's the same number. We'd done another study in 2001, and we looked at 218 foals, and we were looking at the carbohydrate content and the glycemic nature of the feed. But in that, it was an 11.5% incidence of surgical OCD. So that 10% number is pretty consistent in all the studies we've done. That's the good news. The bad news, it's pretty consistent in all the studies we've done. So since the early 90s up until now, that number doesn't seem to be moving very much. It's hovering right around the 10% level. This is surgical OCD though. This is 23 horses, yearlings, that had OCD. The first thing to notice is, again, the bottom 25% don't have very much surgical OCD. An interesting number also, though, is that of surgical OCD, 43% of those were above the 75th percentile as weanlings. So in a normal distribution, that'd be 25%. So that's a pretty big jump. So it looks like that at the other extreme, there may be some issues that contribute to OCD. So again, have a small foal and don't have much OCD. I'll show you later that might not be the best idea if you want a racehorse too, but if you don't want it to have OCD, that's a good idea. This is the height. And look at these numbers. This is pretty hard to believe. This is 23 horses. Look at them, the pink, when they were weanlings. None of the horses that had OCD were in the 25th, below the 25th percentile as weanlings. I mean, so there was a really strong protective from having a short foal. And I guess that goes in if you look at the biomechanics of these problems and whatnot. But this is happening very early on. This isn't a growth-related issue necessarily. This is happening from when 1 month of age. So it's the size of the foal when it's born. If we do the 50 above and below, again, this is surgical. And it looks like the weight persists a little bit further in the ones that are surgical, and certainly it persists longer in the height. So you see that 70% of the month 1 foals were above the median, but as yearlings, 70% were above the median. So there seems to be some relationships there. The thing that blew me away with these data, though, and Todd, I think this is what we were talking about before, this is the month that these OCDs occurred. The orange I've got is when the foals are born. You would think that if it was just random, you'd have the same percentage of OCD. Look where the OCD occurred. It was in April foals. It was greatly overrepresented. Look at February foals. There was half as much OCD for the February foals. All of these were occurring in April foals. This is both that were in the spring survey and also those that are surgical. So it was very skewed to April foals having OCD. So the summary of the spring survey is it seems like heavier, taller foals have a higher prevalence. There's a low incidence in the little guys, and there's a high incidence in April foals. Let's move to sesamoiditis. Now, all of the studies that I've reported before then, we never looked at sesamoiditis. And the reason we didn't is they had not invented digital radiography yet. And if you're taking a film x-ray, it's kind of hard to see the sesamoid bones. And so it used to not be a problem. We never talked about sesamoiditis. Then with the advent of digital radiography, you're seeing lots of things happening in the sesamoid, and suddenly everyone's very interested in sesamoiditis. Again, we had sesamoiditis described in all different shapes and forms by location, but we had a lot that were mild, moderate, just sesamoiditis, and slight. So we had mild and slight, and I wasn't quite sure what the difference was there. We didn't try to grade these, which we recognize that there's a big difference between severity. But in order to do that, we're going to have to get the guys that are reading the radiographs to tell us, is it bad or is it good? It's hard from these descriptions for us to do much, so we just left it as one big bucket of sesamoiditis. We had a 24% incidence in the spring survey of sesamoiditis and a 16% incidence in sale radiographs. So there was less in the sale radiograph, or they were being a little more honest in the spring radiograph, depending on how cynical you want to be about the way that it's being read. It turns out they're actually very different problems in terms of their relationship to growth. So this is the spring survey radiographs for foals that had sesamoiditis, and look at the first two. When they're on the mare, it's unrelated. Those distributions look like the NSA horses. They're not skewed like the OCD horses. It's quite different, that they seem to be fairly normal. The thing is, they start to get bigger as weanlings, and they're real big here, but remember, this is a spring survey, so most of this was actually taken before these weights were taken. So they were headed in that direction, though. So when they're still nursing, there wasn't really any effective size. This is the wither height. This is kind of an interesting finding between sucklings and weanlings. So when they were weanlings, the fourth quartile, the tall ones, more of them became taller. So as weanlings, 38% of them were in the fourth quartile. This is height, not weight. So this is height gain at this point. So there seemed to be a growth spurt, if you will, in height in these horses. Now I'm switching gears to the sale radiographs. So this is a different population of horses. This is the 16% that were actually at the sale. You don't see anything real remarkable when they're on the mare, but look at the weanling weight and the yearling weight, and I think this is relevant. 41% of the foals that have sesamoiditis in the sale were in the second quartile as weanlings. But look what happened as yearlings. They went from the second quartile to the third quartile. So that went down, that went up. This is where these foals that were below the median a little bit ended up above the median. So it looks as if maybe those foals had gotten a little behind, and in the process of getting them ready for the sale, to get them in the correct sales condition, they changed quartiles. So there was a big shift from second quartile to third quartile. And this just shows it in that 50% graph. This is the median weight for sale sesamoiditis. So they are not big yearlings. It was 50 percentile at birth, but look as sucklings and weanlings, it actually went down a little bit. Now these are the same foals in all four quartiles, because I threw out the ones if we were missing weights. So they went born in the 50th, they ended up in the 44th as weanlings, and then they went up to the 60th as yearlings. And so that, I think, is an issue with some of the ones getting sesamoiditis for sale, is maybe they're a little behind and they're being pushed at that point. And we should also say, and we don't know, sesamoiditis has a lot to do with their activity, the ground that they've got, how they're running around. So there's a lot of other things underlying this. Here's the incidence of sesamoiditis by month of birth. So here we have all foals. This is sale sesamoiditis, and it closely followed the regular foals, but spring sesamoiditis, there were more in February. So the foals that developed spring sesamoiditis, they seem to be overrepresented in the early foals rather than the late ones. That's the spring radiograph. This is kind of interesting. This was a single farm that had a lot of February foals and it had a lot of sesamoiditis. And when we divided the horses into those two different categories, this is on a single farm. February foals that got sesamoiditis, February foals that didn't get sesamoiditis. And we looked at the mean across time. The ones that didn't get sesamoiditis were born pretty big, but they stayed pretty level the entire time. The ones that got sesamoiditis, they started smaller and they ended up bigger than these guys here. So that's sort of an interesting representation of what's going on with those February foals. So sesamoiditis, there wasn't really a size effect when the foals were nursing. It seems like the spring may be related to height gain as weanlings and more in February foals. And sesamoiditis at sale seems to be average size to even smaller foals getting pushed into a higher weight category as yearlings. So here, and this is amazing to me, this is all sesamoiditis, or spring sesamoiditis, and spring OCD. So this is just the spring survey. Look at when that occurs. It's a completely different group, but what we found is it's a different group of horses. The horses that got OCD in the spring, only 20% of them had sesamoiditis. 80% of them didn't. And those that got sesamoiditis in the spring, only 16% of them had OCD. So they're two different populations of horses. So I guess take your choice of which direction you would like to go, but they are truly two different groups of horses in this little group of horses anyway. This is foal weight though. Again, the first month of age, this is all sesamoiditis, all OCD, all foals. There's the foals that get OCD were bigger, and this is statistically significant, heavier than those that were developed sesamoiditis. So they're two different problems, or two different populations of horses that seem to happen at two different times of the year. A lot of this makes sense though if you look at the way the seasonal effect is on how foals grow. This is a big study that we did with 3,900 mares and their foals. These is, as you know, when Steve weighs a foal that's still on the mare, he weighs the mare at the same time, and he body condition scores both of them. So we had 3,900 mares and their foals, and we could compare how the foal was growing compared to how the mare's weight was changing at the same time. And this was a huge study. It was 50 commercial farms. And look at those numbers there. I mean, we had 1,000 foals in each month. So it's a very robust study. This is average daily gain. And again, this is kilos a day, so double it. But what you see is during the first 30 days, those first two are January and February foals. They grow a lot slower during the first 30 days than the foals that are later. But this is the mare's daily weight change as well. Those January and February mares are losing weight during the first month of gestation, of lactation. All of the ones that are born later actually start gaining weight even during the first month. This is month of lactation, that is month of year. And you can see it's a seasonal effect. When the grass comes on in April, all of the mares start to gain weight. Before, in February and March, the mares lose weight. We looked at the relationship of how the foal grows relative to how the mare is doing. Foal body weight, body condition score, and average daily gain were positively correlated with the mare's body weight, body condition score, and average daily gain. Heavier mares produce heavier foals. Faster growing foals were from mares that were gaining weight. So if the mare is gaining weight during lactation, the foal grows faster. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is for you all to decide. But fatter mares also produce fatter foals. And winter-born foals are smaller and they grow slower during the first couple of months. They catch up later. And if you look at how these foals grow and you look at where they are in their growth cycle, it starts to make sense. First, look at the first month. This is April foals here. So that's 2 kilos a day. That is 4.5 pounds a day that those April foals are growing during the first month. Compared to, here's January and February foals down here at about 1.75. So there's a big difference in how they grow early. But look at them during weaning. If you get out here, the February foals, which are the orange here, are actually gaining a lot more weight during weaning than the April and May ones after weaning. Probably the April and May are weaned earlier in terms of number of days, and they're also weaned, the early foals are weaned into a period where the grass starts to grow again in the fall. They are more used to eating without milk. They're probably older. They take advantage of that and they grow quicker as weanlings. The April and May ones grow fast really early on, but then they slow down during the weaning time. So if we look at the distribution, and this is this study now, I'm switching back to the one we're talking about now. This is the distribution of foal weight during the first 30 days. So for February foals, it's 50-50. Look at January foals. 77% of the January foals were less than the 50th percentile. Look at the other end. This is April and May foals. 74% of the April foals were greater than 50%. 83% of the May foals were greater than 50%. That's when they're first born. It looks basically the same up to 6 months. That there's a big discrepancy between February and April. This is their size as weanlings though. This is the same group of horses. So as weanlings, you see it swap completely. That the February foals, 64% of them are bigger than average, and the April foals, actually it's come back. So if you look at those two together, they were 50-50, now they're 64-36. And the April ones that were big when they were on the mare have slowed down because they're gaining at a lower rate at weaning. So there's a big body distribution shift, and some of that may contribute to this kind of difference between whether they get OCD or whether they get sesamoiditis. There's certainly a lot of factors that are going to affect birth weight. A lot of those early foaling mares are probably maidens too. So you've got to take that into consideration, how long the pregnancy is, abnormalities, certainly month of birth, the day length and the temperature at the time can affect that, as can the genetics of the horse. If you look at day length in Kentucky though, if you look at length of day by season, there's a big difference that occurs in day length of about 5 hours per day from the dead of winter into spring. If you're foaling horses here, you're foaling them at a much lower day length. And there's an interesting study that was just published a couple of years ago by the Equine people, the ones that have the lights that go in. They put those on pregnant mares that were foaling early, and they increased foal birth weight. So there was exposure to artificially extended day length, increased foal birth weight compared to controls. So by actually putting lights on the pregnant ones, the day length, they were tricking the February ones to think that they were April. So day length probably does have a role to play, but so does the temperature, and so does pasture availability, because if the mare's losing weight in lactation, its foal's not going to gain as much as if it's gaining weight. The other big thing that we haven't taken into account in this study at all is the stallion. We have looked at the effect of different stallions, and we're not going to publish who those stallions are, but we looked at all of the stallions where we had more than 50 foals that we could compare. And we looked at them at these different ages and where they were relative to the 50th percentile. And what you see is they're all over the place. This is weight and this is height. Here's a great big stallion. Here's one that's actually below. These are all name brand big stallions they're very successful, that have lots of good racehorses. That's why we have so many of them in our population. But look at the variability that you have. Look at height variability in these. So there's a lot of stallion influence, which again makes our data even more incredible with all that difference in genetics, that we're still seeing these differences. So does any of this matter? Yearling size and sales price. I told you we did that study in 2009. In this study, it made even more of a difference. This is median sales price compared to the yearling's body weight and the yearling's height, first, second, third, fourth quartile. I guess there's inflation from 2009. $30,000 was the median sales price for those little ones that don't get OCD. $150,000 was the fourth quartile. So it went from 30, 70, 90, 150. There was a huge difference there. And height, the same sort of thing. yeah, the expensive horses are bigger. So we did it as the percent of the session that they're sold in, the percent of the median session price, and it's still there. So you can see that first quartile brought 71% of whatever session they were sold in. The big guys, 150%. Height, first and second quartile height, it didn't seem to make too much difference, but when you got in the third and fourth quartile, it did. So there is definitely a difference here in terms of this size. What about racing performance? Does it really make any difference? This is unraced horses. And so these were horses in the population that for whatever reason never made a start. And there's not much of a pattern here, but there are a multitude of reasons why a horse wouldn't make a start. So I guess it's probably, you would sort of expect. They could have run through a fence or, broken a leg or done whatever. There's not really that much of an effect. Here's winner's weight though. This is, you can see that there's not a huge effect of winner's weight here. 16, 19, 20, 19. So 20 versus 25 is not a huge difference. So there's not a real clear pattern for, this is horses winning a race regardless of how good the race is. But look at height. Winner's height, you can see it starts to get interesting. The foals that were in the 25th, the first quartile, only 12% of them won a race. This is the percentile for height, so it goes back towards that. This is horses that did start and never won a race. So the other end, and we start to see while this other extreme might be an issue, you can see that as yearlings, 41% of the horses that got to the races but never won were in the fourth quartile. And if you go to height, that persisted kind of across the way. So these horses that were bigger, are taller and heavier, 38% of them that didn't win a race were in the fourth quartile. So we're painting a picture of really small and really big may not be where you want to go. It's kind of in that middle is probably the place that you want to be. Now we get into the money question, stakes winners. And this is body weight. Again, we have 7% of the foals the first month that are in the 25th percentile that won a stakes race. That number is the same that had OCD. So if you want a horse to not have OCD, be in the bottom 25th, if you also don't want it to win a stakes race, is sort of the take home there. Even look at yearlings. Only 6% of the horses that won stakes races in this population were in the bottom 25th as weight. So, I mean, that goes back to looking at the price that's being paid as yearlings too. They're kind of making the same sort of deal, and height follows the same thing. Look at this. 0% of the stakes winners were in the bottom 25th percentile when they were still on the mare. And 7% the first month, but you see this persisted along the way. But this is an interesting, 17%, only 17% of them were in that really high area. But that's an astounding graph to me when I told you how little that variation is between height. That even with that narrow curve, that it has this sort of knock-on effect for stakes winners, I think it is pretty interesting. So what about the radiographic findings in sales price? Are they related? Should we be worried about them from a sales perspective? This is a graph of all the horses in the study, those that had stifle OCDs, and this is in the spring radiograph. And I confused people yesterday, so I've cleared it up some in this today. This is just spring radiographs. All horses, stifle OCD, hock OCD, and fetlock OCD. This is the percent that was sold, the percent that was not sold, and the percent that was RNA'd. Well, you can not sell one for a lot of reasons, because you're keeping it as a homebred and it may go on to be a superior racehorse. That doesn't really say very much. If you look at RNAs though, There's actually stifle. If they took them to the sale, they wanted to sell them. So the RNA was actually a little bit lower. This is the sale price, and I've clarified this from yesterday by looking at which radiograph we're talking about. So here we have the incidence in the spring radiographs, the incidence in sales radiographs, and then all of them combined together. Here is the different lesions, the number that were in that population, their average price and their median price. Average price, you can see stifle OCDs really deflated the value of the horse. This is in a spring radiograph. This is not the radiograph that was actually seen at the sale. Now, in this case, there were 10 that had stifle OCD. There were only 2 that actually ended up in the sale that had stifle OCD. But those are the same horses. So there were 2 horses that they had stifle OCDs in the spring, and they still had them in the fall. All of the others that had stifle OCD, they either operated them and it didn't show up in the sale radiograph, or they got better on their own. But it's really telling that the 2 that did have OCD in the radiograph, and I have not sorted these by severity at all. This is anything that had OCD in the stifle. It didn't matter the location or the size. I threw them in that bucket. Those 2 had an average price of $5,500. And you can't calculate a median if you've only got 2 horses, so that's why there's none here. Hock OCDs, I should say all of the yearlings in this study had an average sales price of $172 and a median of $76. So that attests to how good Hallway Feed is, that these are pretty expensive horses that they're selling for that kind of level. But if you look, the ones that had Hock OCDs in their spring radiograph, it was the same, a little above the average, and it was above the median. If you look at how many had Hock OCDs in their sale radiograph, it was 0. So either those Hock OCDs had been corrected surgically or they got better on their own, because they were not in the horses in any of the sale radiographs that we did. Fetlock OCD, there were 11 in the spring. They had an average of 266 and a median of 250. I mean, again, compared to a median of 76. There were 4 that were in the sale radiograph, and I went back and checked this. These 4 that had Fetlock OCD in their sales radiograph did not have it in their spring radiograph. They developed that OCD between the 2 radiographs. Again, we're not talking about the severity, and again, it didn't really hurt their price very much. So whoever saw those OCDs in the sale radiograph, they determined that's not a problem, and we're going to pay a lot of money for them.
Probably were late babies.
Yeah, and that's when it goes back to those spring, those surveys, looking at that those that were May foals that were only 300 days old, they may have developed after that, but they didn't seem to be necessarily all that severe. Radiographic findings and racing performance. This is median earnings, and I've got to say this is not a complete set of data either, because some of these horses are still running. This went from 2013 to 17, so you got to take this with a grain of salt because they're continuing to run. But if you look at the median earnings up to now, this is all OCD, no OCD. There wasn't that much difference. Even the median earnings for the fetlock was in the same ballpark. The median earnings for the stifle, the median earnings for the fetlock was actually higher. And this is median earnings. If you throw in average earnings, it kind of goes all over the place. What you see though is those stifle OCDs, regardless of whether they sold or not, it didn't matter. It's if they raced, we counted their earnings. Their average earnings was only $23,000. Look at Hock OCDs, it went up to $400,000. But that was because there was a horse that won a big pile of money that was in that had a hock OCD that was taken out after the spring radiograph, and it went on and became a superior racehorse. But you can see, I mean, from these earnings, it doesn't look like these OCDs have really slowed the earnings, except stifle OCDs. I'll still put that in a different category, and this is not sorting by the severity of the stifle OCD. So it's a interesting finding. The one thing that we found about hock OCDs, though, is we looked at the age at first start. What were they, 2-year-olds or 3-year-olds, basically? And we found that the ones that had hock OCD at spring radiographs, because remember, none of them at sale had hock OCDs, they started later. It was an average of 2.8 versus 2.3 for the others, and that is statistically significant. That is a difference. Sesamoiditis. If you look at median sales price, here is sesamoiditis in the spring. They actually had a median of 100. Here is no sesamoiditis at the sale, 72, with sesamoiditis at the sale, 70. So there wasn't that much difference. And actually, if you look at the median price, the ones in the spring sold for above the median of the session they were going in. The ones that at sale were above the session median. This says nothing about the horses that were kept at home because they had sesamoiditis, though, that didn't get entered in the sale. So that's again, take this one with a big grain of salt. These are the ones that actually got presented for sale. Racing performance, we're worried about their durability. The age at first start, it didn't make any difference, and also the total number of starts, it didn't make any difference. But again, this is an incomplete data set because some of them are still running today. Conclusions. Body weight and height are related to the incidence of OCD and sesamoiditis, but it seems like in this study in completely different ways. Month of birth was a huge factor. February for sesamoiditis, April for OCD. But this is a take-home message too. Correlation is not necessarily causation. We're talking about all of these relationships, but we have no idea if one caused the other. They're related, but we don't know that they're caused because this is all retrospective data. So again, big grain of salt with that. I think this tells the tale, though. We're trying to operate with a very wide range of birth times when we have spring pasture coming on at different times, and we have very different weaning times in terms of their physiological age. Both when they're foals and then as yearlings, we're taking a snapshot in a fairly narrow window for those foals that have a big range of birth dates, and we're overlaying sales prep on top of this. So I think really getting all of that in sync and understanding those effects is what this weighing program is going to ultimately be best for. Thank you. So what's next? We need more data. I mean, this is really cool stuff, but it's only 250 foals that we've got in the growth data. We need more farms with more foal records where we can compare the survey data. We can look at the GrowTrack data because we collect that, but to overlay it with their problems, we need that information. We also need more information. How long were those foals confined? What is the effect of confining January and February foals? Weaning dates and ages, that's something we certainly can get. I think that's going to tell a lot about the age at weaning, separating the April and the May foals from the January, February foals. And we need to standardize the radiographic findings because that's, we're putting into too big of buckets. We're not getting a fine enough point on whether these problems actually are meaningful or if they're just something that you can ignore. And we need to find other factors that can affect growth and performance. So what are our goals out of all of this? Identify at-risk foals earlier and hopefully modify their feed and management practices ahead of time to try to reduce the incidence of problems. And as we get this more and more right and we can use these data, hopefully we can raise a better racehorse, which is really kind of at the end of the day, the sales numbers are interesting and whatnot, but really what's the most important thing is how good a racehorse do they become. And I think that we can use these data to help refine the way that we're managing these. And one other thing, and Jeff brought this up yesterday, and it's an excellent point, we've got some big changes from year to year, and this is getting worse, not better. Last season, last spring, we had some real differences in temperature and rainfall and that sort of thing. We need to be able to, when faced with that sort of thing, and understanding what sort of growth patterns can lead to problems, predict that that sort of change is actually going to have an effect and do something about it ahead of the curve rather than after the curve. So I'll stop at that. Thank you for your attention and be happy to answer a question or two. Thanks.
Hey Joe, I don't know, maybe you covered it, maybe I missed it, but have you looked at the size of the mare and size of the foal, and if there's any relationship there?
In that big study that we did with the 3,900, bigger mares had bigger foals. So yeah, there was. So just the actual size of the mare made a difference. But then once you have the size, if they're gaining weight, the foal grows faster. If they're losing weight, the foal grows slower.
And have you looked at size of the mare and then at yearling weight or size there too?
We have not. No, and we should. I mean, we could. That data set, it was nice because, again, Steve was weighing the lactating mare and the foal at the same time. So we took those records. It'd be interesting to carry out and find the others, how that's affecting ultimately for yearling. But in that study, we stopped with just where we had records on both the mare and foal.
The last few years, most of the managers really hadn't been interested in their weight, and they want us, of course, get in and get out. So we haven't been taking them, with the exception of a few farms that wanted to continue. But
Well, now we know we should.
at this point, we need to reevaluate.
Joe, in answering his question with correlation to mare size and foal size, do we have heights on those mares, or is that just weight?
No, we've never taken.
No,
So,
it's purely body weight.
you would most often expect a taller mare to be heavier.
That study was height and condition score.
Big part of those mares wouldn't let me get up to.
That might be a workers' comp issue.
We got a few of those.
You made a reference a couple slides back to time confined. Is your thinking there on birthdays of foals, and because they foal earlier in the season that they're spend more time in the stall?
Oh, absolutely.
Or does it have to do with babies that might be injured?
Well, both. I think there's certainly, the way almost everybody raises horses here, if it's January, February foal, they're probably going to stay in at night and only be turned out during the day. And that foal's going to be laying on its side rather than running around. And then, and since we did that very first study, everyone's become much more conscious of that. And when they change it, they normally do it in small paddocks and work them back up. But a big change in the way that they transition them, because I do remember back in that day that we weren't worried about sesamoiditis, we were worried about sesamoid fractures in those, where you turned them out all at once in April and the mare goes tearing across a big paddock and the foal comes back with a fractured sesamoid. And I remember Dr. McElraith, the preeminent orthopedic surgeon, had a very good expression about the sesamoid bone in a foal. He said they were soft as goose shit, I think was the scientific definition of those sesamoids at that time. So that's a big deal, but we think also that if you've got a mare that gets hurt or you have to confine the foal, that lack of activity and then resuming activity has a big effect. We know in adult horses and 2-year-olds, if we lock them up, they demineralize their bones. We've shown that if without activity, they lose bone density. The astronauts do too. That's one of the reasons they're not wanting to, one of the problems with space flight. But probably the same thing happens with the foals too. But I mean, it's sort of staggering when you look at a first month that a foal's gaining 3 or 4 pounds of body weight a day, how fast they're growing in that early period, and then you lock them up at the same time. So and Steve certainly understands that this is important. We've been struggling to get that data in a way that we can actually deal with it, and that's one of the challenges that we want. So really what we're asking for, the reason we wanted to show you this is a pilot study. It's a small number of horses. We want to recruit you guys to do more of this. And kind of the good thing is, since we have spring surveys potentially from way back, we can gather a lot of data on horses that we've already weighed and that you've already done your surveys on. We just need to get together and be able to harvest those data and make the radiographs where we can put them into the correct bucket of problems. So we would like to ask you to help us with that and come up with ways that we can put these other factors into the program.
Probably in the retrospective stuff, it'll just be kind of the spring and cell radiographs and what we see. Going forward, we would like to include some of these other factors.
Yeah, because I think all of those are playing a role together. I think it comes down to the name of the game is management, is what's leading to a lot of these. Managing around this tricky growing period of a lot of grass in April and then it coming back in the fall.
Do you all see a range in how much feed you sell by the month of the year? And dip, like you were saying, when the grass really comes on, I wonder how many people back off their feed and things of that nature.
Yeah, well, I think go ahead.
Yes, and I think it's for product, Bobby, as you start less mare feed, if we look at overall volume of what we're producing and selling, it's picking up with sales prep, it's picking up with supplements, you're not feeding
Kind of
scale,
one
you're
into
feeding
one.
mare cube.
Yeah, one
So,
season to the next.
Yeah, I'd have to, again, like Joe's data, you'd have to really drill down and look at this more product specific.
Mm-hmm.
So
For us,
that's
it's
right.
more horse number related.
Yeah.
For us, November, end of October, November, 1st of December, probably, not even the 1st of December, there's about 6 weeks in there are fairly, not light, but lighter for us simply because sales yearlings are all gone. You're talking about thousands of head of horses that now are gone.
Leader, yeah.
Yeah, they're gone, but our racing deal, is 50% of what we do. So that's steady all year long. Those horses are just moving from venue to venue. Breeding farms, it's pretty flat except for those few months when the mares are not eating much and the yearlings are gone.
I mean, I think most farm managers are making adjustments by
Well, I think
eye.
we're better than we used to be.
But I think that we could use these data, if we can get it back and you can see it early on, to help make some of those decisions, which is one of the things we're aspiring to do, is make it where we can react to these data instead of waiting.
When it comes to my farm, I value his opinion.
Sure.
I think we kind of use that and we go up or down based on what these guys are telling us. But, you certainly learned a lot. And I love that graph on where you can sesamoiditis versus the racehorses. I wish we could take that out there and post that. But, I know some people, no matter what, they wouldn't believe that.
Well, and remember this is a small study, there have been some bigger studies looking at suspensory issues and sesamoiditis, and I think there's a giant one that McElraith has got funding for. These looking at a lot of x-rays. So this, I would much rather wait to see that big data as opposed to just a few.
I don't worry about OCDs near like I used, or sesamoiditis now. Man, it's just a killer.
Yeah.
And I think most people in there would say that.
Well, like I say, it's a new disease for us because
We need to get rid of those fancy machines.
yeah, exactly. That would solve it all. Yes, sir.
How detailed would you be looking at information regarding turnout structure on a horse in terms of, I don't think a lot of us, many farm managers around here are really paying attention to this horse had a little bit of fasciitis for a few weeks, so we kept him up during the day. I don't know how many people are really keeping records of this horse had
Sure.
1 week of 4 more hours inside than before.
No, I hear
It's
you.
not hard to go back and look and say, hey, this horse had a temp. You know, when this horse had a temp, he's inside for 48 hours, so he's locked down, everything was fine after that. We can find those records, but moving forward, we need to start keeping the right records.
Right.
And how detailed do you want?
Yeah,
them?
and that has been a problem with Steve collecting these data, is how do you get it in a efficient way that it doesn't consume a lot of time. We can get the confinement stuff about what you're doing with your January and February foals, because that tends to happen in groups, you know, when it's changing. But we need to devise something that's easy for you to do, that we can also get some meaningful numbers. And again, that's one of the challenges that we hope Steve can help.
Don't hit the researcher in much detail. Yes, I've been at this since 1989. But all this data, that's actually, this issue data, Megan told me. And she's the one that starts it. She weighs and condition scores just as well as I do, and she's beginning to develop her own group of people that she actually takes care of. So,
And is a hell of a lot more pleasant to deal with. But Bobby said it all. I mean, one of the best things about this program is that Steve and Megan are looking at a lot of horses at a lot of different places at the same time, which really is invaluable to have somebody looking outside your farm and giving that kind of advice.
Sometimes they probably get tired of answering them, but I think if you're gonna raise good horses, you have to do these things. And I think it's important, and I mean, I'm just really, I appreciate y'all taking the time to show us this.
You bet.
But if you want us to provide data to you, we need you to put in writing.
we need a pattern, we
We
need
you
to
to
figure
put
it out.
together something for us to have, that this is the data you'd like to have. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody might
Jump on.
and provide that data, but I suspect most everybody
Sure.
is, because we're all trying to accomplish the same thing.
Well, one of the things that'll get us way down the line is the survey radiographs. And, you know, those are data that it's basically 2 vet clinics, and if we can get it standardized, that it's much easier for us to get. The management data is something that, yeah, we do need to tell you exactly what we want, and that's on us to figure that out.
Well, in those graphs, nobody knows who we are.
Oh, no, it's completely anonymous. I mean, we're not gonna to talk about any specific farm or horse for that matter. And, you know, we take that very seriously. I'll tell a funny story, though, that I remember that 1994 roundtable. So this is 25 years ago, and I remember this because I'm sitting there and I'm going, God, I'm with Larry Bramblage and Wayne McElraith, and they're, you know, we're talking about all this stuff. And I was just super paranoid about talking about any horse or farm or anything like that. And Larry, this is right after the Derby, Larry goes, yeah, I operated the 2nd and 3rd place in the Derby, and he named the horse's name and I'm just going, oh my God. So that was a great deal of confidence by the gigantic one that he would talk that freely, because we never do that. We
I think
always.
it's fair to say we won't talk about them with them in the room, but we'll talk about them with everybody else in the room.
Now, what would be helpful, are you putting something together about this where we all
Yeah.
can take it home and look at it? And you are?
Oh, absolutely. But I mean, it's funny. I've been showing these guys some of the data, and it's been a moving target, because actually the last thing I did was look at the effective month of birth, and then it kind of all started to fall into place. Why, you know, these things were happening. It was so related to when it was that the foals were born and how they were growing at specific times. So yes, we will, but you're literally the second group to see these data. Yesterday was the first, so this is pretty fresh stuff. And even I clarified, you know, yesterday it was good because I clarified some of that sale data on when the radiograph was taken relative to sales price. So we will, but it's not a finished product to do yet.
Phil, there's a question right here.
I'm sorry.
Well, I was just curious, you had the data correlated to stakes winners.
Mhm.
I was wondering if you'd ever thought about if there was any correlation to breakdowns, which I know is kind of a hot topic right now.
I couldn't find that information on Equibase.
Yeah. Yeah, and so that's an issue. I mean, the information on sales and racing is publicly available. You can go onto Equibase and get it. You probably could find that information on catastrophic.
The farms know if they will share it.
Well, and it's probably available, but we don't have those data. I mean, that's the ultimate question: is how good are they and how sound are they? So we're using like total starts and that sort of thing as a little bit of a proxy of soundness, which we get it's not the same thing, but it's that's certainly something we'd love to do, but we just don't have the data.
Before we move on, you gotta understand, when we started this, if the farm managers had have thought we'd been keeping any kind of records on what we saw or heard on those farms, we'd have never been allowed back on the farm.
Take that crack away from me.
And this little sample that we've gotten is a major step forward for us. It's the first time we've really been able to say this actually showed up as far as joint issues. So, yeah, we've got a long ways to go, but it took us a long time to get to this point.
You had one more question?
So have you done a farm-to-farm comparison?
And that's something about this little sample size. There was huge farm effects, huge. In both the genetics that they had on the farm, the size of their paddocks, there were big effects.
Geographical location?
No, it's all central Kentucky, so that didn't matter. But there were farm effects here, so that's another grain of salt to add to it. I think as we get more and more farms, that effect becomes smaller and smaller. But in that small database, it's pretty important.
I think that's a great point. And if I were, and I know Bobby Spalding's thinking about this because he likes to pick everybody's brain. But if I'm in a farm manager's position, I'm picking Megan and Steve's brain about differences from farm to farm. I don't need to know who the farm is, but what are the people doing that are having the best success? We're taking for granted we're feeding the same products generally. I mean, there may be a few little nuances, but not dramatic. And so Hinkles are getting along and doing a hell of a job and doing, really, really well and having very few problems. Then on the other end of the spectrum, there's Summerwind and they're train wrecking. So I wanted to,
I'm trying to get a turn back up.
Go ahead, Dr. Craig.
Okay, Hinkles train wrecking and somebody. Anyway, I'm sitting there thinking I'm in part of this program. I would just want to know, hey, boil all this down for me every 6 months or year to year. What's somebody doing that's consistently working? Where am I missing? If I'm consistently doing something, potentially stumbling, and I've identified that I don't necessarily have a genetic issue, we've gotten rid of those mares. Obviously, there's the wild card of the stallions that nobody's going to share with you about, obviously the stallion owners know, but you're not going to find that out. But what can I learn from that? And I would certainly be quizzing these people on that. And they'd share that with you, what they're seeing that people are particularly doing, whether it's, and I think most importantly, how they're managing weight on young growing horses, probably, for sure. Just thoughts of that sort.
Yeah,
I put them on the spot, though.
I mean, I think part of our problem is what's good and what's bad. What farms are doing. What are the parameters that we're saying is a good farm? Is it their sales average, the number of stakes winners, the incidence of problems? So getting these data help with that, though. I noticed, Bobby, when I did put up those percentages of things, you were writing that down. So those are important data to have, is what is the incidence for a industry-wide, so you do have a yardstick to compare to. But again, small data set, few farms, so don't take those too literally as what the target. The older studies, not the latest study. I mean, literally, you guys are the first to see it. The older data is all in the published literature for the 3900 with the mares and foals. Those earlier OCD studies have been published long ago.
I'm just asking us some more.
But this, well, the new is, we've got to make sure that we've looked at every angle and get it analyzed before we go. And a lot of this, when I first started doing it, and if we're going to publish it, we need to do odds ratios for this. And so statistically, that's the way you need to ask the question, but it becomes a little confusing about what you're doing when you're talking about it in this situation. So we still need to do odds ratios on all of these before actually publishing it in the literature.
I wanted to know, is there much variation from year to year or season to season? For example, this fall, some of our average daily gains weren't quite where we wanted to see them. Would the reference comparisons over the entire study have been different across just a reference for this year with the dry fall?
Right, which that's an excellent question, and we're trying for our big global reference curve or a global Kentucky curve, we're trying to take the seasonality out by doing a bunch of years. But what we would like to be able to do is start to have year-by-year comparisons so that we can say, yeah, this year was different than we've seen in the past. So if you're seeing less gain or whatnot, it's not just you, it's happening industry-wide. So that's something we're aspiring to, again, is to try to provide those sorts of data.
We're really making an effort to give you more feedback on the data that we're getting from your farms. And some, even as I see the future of some of this, if we can even get consistent contribution of X-ray results, that we're able to then go in and say, like Joe said, there was significant farm effects. Well, then we have a way to benchmark things. OCD, somewhere between 9 and 12% incidence of OCD is kind of sounds typical, not extraordinary. But if you end up with a farm with 25%, then you can go to that farm and say, hey guys, you've got a higher incidence than usual. Here's what the farms that have the typical or the lower incidence are doing that you might consider doing differently on your farm and seeing if it has an effect.
How many horses and years of study would you need until you would be able to say it's significant, like we really have a baseline here?
For the incidence of disease and whatnot?
Well, I mean, just the whole...
Yeah, I would say over 1,000, and the more the better. I mean, I think 1,000, but Steve, how many horses are you weighing a month now? I mean, they're gathering those.
Well, we pick up about somewhere between 700 and 800 and something a year in new babies. So somewhere in that range.
On a month-to-month basis, like right now, excuse me, it's about 1,500 right now because everything's left. But heaviest times of the year, you're looking at July, August, sales growing season, we're close to 2,000.
So if you could get all the farms to get all this information to you pretty much for one group, that at least gives you a pretty good standard for that year.
I think we could get big data pretty quickly if we can figure out how to standardize these radiographs so that it says that it's sesamoiditis severity 1 or 2 or 3, or it's a stifle OCD 1, 2, 3, that allows us to sort it more quickly, because that was frankly the thing that took so long, was just trying to make some sense out of the survey data. And once we get that, and that's with the cooperation of the vet clinics, and the vet clinics we've talked to are interested in doing that. I mean, they're also acknowledging that it's going to be, in some instances, it's hard for their own vets to describe within their own clinic how to describe it. So that is a work in progress, because we're wanting to spread this outside of Kentucky also. I was just in Australia in the Hunter Valley talking to those farms, and we're talking about doing it in England as well.
Well, I was going to ask that question because, if you go there a lot, where I used to be able to do that, it's amazing the size difference in the thoroughbred horse there than compared to here. And these little Galileos look like little deer, and they're running all. I mean, so there's huge differences, and in Australia, it's stifle cysts that are the big deal.
it's a different environment and it's a different problem. They have different genetics too. There's some of that, but we've got a company that we work with in England called Saracen that works very closely with Hallway, and I did a comparison of these environmental effects for one of the Thoroughbred Breeders Association seminars. So I compared the Kentucky data and England. That blip that you see, that April thing, it happens in England. It looks identical, but it happens in May. And if you look at the temperature difference and when day length changes, when the soil rises in temperature to a certain degree and the day length gets long enough and it goes, you get exactly the same sort of deal, but it's not the same at all. It's displaced by a month because they're further north, so it's a more temperate and the day length changes. It doesn't get up to a certain number of hours until later in the year. So I think
Imagine how much more they leave horses in the stall over there.
But trying to do this comparatively, I think will shed some light on, is it a Kentucky thing that's happening?
Yes.
Or is it a thoroughbred thing that's happening everywhere? So we're talking to the vets in Scone about standardizing it for the Australian x-rays, and with Rossdale's in Newmarket about standardizing it. And we want to do this as a global